You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages of the newspapers as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with Stephen Bush, Financial Times Associate Editor and columnist, and Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Eye claims the Prime Minister will not call an early election as groups of his own MPs plot to oust him in anticipation of disastrous local election results. The Mirror leads with demands for Rishi Sunak to call a general election. The Guardian says the Home Office will launch a major operation to detain asylum seekers across Britain on Monday in preparation for their deportation to Rwanda. The Telegraph reports the government has accused the EU of double standards after Ireland vowed to send asylum seekers to the UK despite France refusing to take back Channel migrants. The Mail's front page says thousands of foreign nationals entering Britain on visas are lodging asylum claims to stay permanently. Millions on disability benefits face the biggest welfare reforms in a generation, according to The Times. That could mean those with depression and anxiety lose their payments. The FT reports that the largest Western banks that remain in Russia paid the Kremlin nearly £700 million of taxes last year, despite promises to minimise their Russian exposure after the invasion of Ukraine. The Metro says the price of a pint is set to rise after heavy rain over autumn and winter. Dame Esther Rantzen says she's fighting for her family and lots of others as MPs hold a landmark debate on assisted dying, which The Express says was prompted by their petition. The Sun's front page features the last words of a Gogglebox star who died in an accident recently. Britain is set for a bank holiday heat wave thanks to a plume of warm weather coming via Berlin. That's according to The Star. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Stephen Bush and Kate Andrews. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the Eye front page. Their headline, Sunak to resist early election as Tory rebels on manoeuvres. We have been reading for some time that the Tory rebels are on manoeuvres. Is this really the point at which we will see some dissent against Rishi Sunak, do you think, Stephen?
Yeah, I think, even though in some ways all that is likely to happen at the local elections is it will confirm what every other set of elections we've had in the last 2 years, which is the polls are about right, it is always a different experience for a political party when it undergoes a sort of nationwide electoral test and it flunks it, right? So I think then there will be an outbreak of panic among some Conservative MPs. But, of course, some Conservative MPs have always disliked Rishi Sunak. I think we're probably some way from that expression of panic being something he has to worry about. But I imagine he probably will end up having to face a confidence vote because, of course, it only takes 52 panicked Conservative MPs to trigger one. But you need many more Conservative MPs than 52 for the Prime Minister to be at danger of losing his job.
You can see how they almost accidentally find themselves in a situation where they're voting on the confidence of the Prime Minister, and many MPs didn't actually mean to try to trigger another leadership election. It's not exactly obvious that that is what the public is desperate for, and if that happens, then it's just really unknown what happens from there, because Rishi Sunak will be in a very difficult position where he will have to see his own MPs, some of which will vote against him. Even if he wins, and I think he would probably be likely to win a vote of no confidence, it puts him in a very difficult position, not just in terms of his own premiership, but to continue to lead the country. And that is, I think, why you still have these outstanding questions about whether or not you might see an election before August, probably in July, because it is pretty well known at this point that the government would like the opportunity to do another fiscal event. They would like the opportunity to offer another tax cut. That would have to be happening in the autumn, but they could almost be bounced into having to act before.
The Eye reporting that a backbencher familiar with rebel discussions says that his removal seems inevitable. Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that to be honest, it's a serious plot in that it's well organised and it has some serious money and staffing behind it. But this, from a competence perspective, is probably the least serious attempt to get rid of a Prime Minister than we've seen for a very long time. And then there are a lot of people involved in it who will talk a big game, but they don't have a plausible plan to get a majority of the parliamentary party on board with getting rid of the Prime Minister, and they don't have an alternative candidate. So I think there's a possibility that Rishi Sunak could
Well,
suffer
there
a
have
lot
been
of
names like Penny Mordaunt.
Yeah, but
put in
then
the
people
fray.
like Penny Mordaunt saying, yeah, it's thanks but no thanks, because broadly speaking, the average member of the Conservative Parliamentary Party knows full well that their problems didn't start with Rishi Sunak and are not going to end by getting rid of him. And the average person who's ambitious and wants to lead the Tory party does not think, oh, do you know what, I want to be someone who was Prime Minister for 4 months and then lost really badly. So
It's
I
the
think,
last thing they want.
Yeah, exactly. So this thing is that it's very hard to get rid of a leader when you don't have an alternative candidate. That's why the confidence vote in Boris Johnson failed. It's why the confidence vote in Theresa May failed. What got rid of those two leaders was when a leader emerged, Boris Johnson in the case of Theresa May, Rishi Sunak in the case of Boris Johnson, who was willing to say, I think there's a problem and we need a change. And unless over the next week or so someone in the cabinet stands up and goes, we need a change, and quits, Rishi Sunak is going to be in Downing Street until, October, November, January, or whenever he comes into contact with the electorate himself. And I suspect after that he won't be in Downing Street.
It does feel as though people who are now saying that the Prime Minister will have to leave, realistically, the mechanism to do that from their perspective would be a general election. And this is all very ironic because they are also on the right. They're also within the Conservative Party. But as Stephen has pointed out, for all those reasons, a confidence vote and then a leadership election afterwards is probably not the mechanism this time round.
OK, let's move on to The Guardian. Stephen, you take us into this story, and that is that the Home Office will launch a major operation to detain asylum seekers across Britain from tomorrow.
Yes, from tomorrow. So officials plan to hold refugees who turn up for routine meetings at immigration services or at bail appointments or other contacts with the state to pick up people nationwide in a surprise 2-week exercise. This is in preparation for what they hope will be the first flight to Rwanda of people who've come here by irregular routes. There are, big political and ideological objections to this, and I'm sure Kate will be perfectly eloquent on those. But actually, just from the government's own perspective, I'm not convinced that this is going to be a very effective plan, because broadly speaking, if you're a lawyer, you are going to protect your client by putting as many legal obstacles as you can between them and a flight to Rwanda. And it's perfectly easy and arguably open and shut to say, if my client was told to come here for one reason and was then arrested, there's not a fair case to put them on this flight, even before all of the questions about individual claims and the safety of Rwanda. Because although the bill means you can no longer bring group claims and argues that Rwanda is a safe country in general, it does still give people the opportunity to bring cases against their individual deportation. So I think we might look back at this as yet another step on the road to failing on the Rwanda policy.
And Kate, do you think that simply people won't be turning up for these routine appointments, perhaps on advice of their lawyers?
Well, it's certainly possible if they're aware of this new piece of information. One of the biggest criticisms of the Safety of Rwanda Act was that it did not distinguish between those who might be abusing the asylum system, those who might be coming for economic reasons, and genuine asylum claims. And what we heard constantly from ministers is, don't worry, we'll get around to that bit. What's so concerning about this news is that they are jumping right in to trying to detain migrants who they want to put on these planes. You are going to have people being detained who are some of the most vulnerable people who've been through things we do not want to imagine. They're going to be bringing them in for routine services. They're saying that they're even going to be doing a 2-week blitz where they try to find people and round them up. I mean, expect to see a lot of media around this. The government thinks this is going to go down well. They think this is an important part of their election strategy. You are going to have a lot of tragic stories wrapped up in all of this. And that will be a real consequence that the government was warned about, that if you don't make provisions for genuine asylum seekers, you are going to lump them in with a lot of other people, and that way is simply to lead to disaster, because unless you are from a few select countries, there is no legal way to come to the UK as an asylum seeker, except to show up and say, I am one. And the new plan, and I think this is going to be very public, is that you'll be detained.
And into the mix, furthering this discussion of illegal migration, we have the deterioration, I suppose, in relation between Dublin and Westminster, with Dublin saying that they will send any migrants back to the UK, and the UK saying that we won't accept them. That's coming up in the Times.
Yeah, this is a consequence, really, of the way that our relationship with the EU has changed since Brexit. And basically, the EU's plan for managing irregular migration has long been, well, we'll get a country on our border to deal with it for us. paying quite a lot of money to Turkey to deal with it, or quite a lot of money to the various contested governments in Libya to deal with that problem. Now, understandably, if you are the British Prime Minister, you go, well, I don't want to do that. That's going to be really unpopular politically for me here at home. And so there was always going to be an element of friction between the UK and its nearest European neighbour, because we are now on the frontier of the EU's own difficulties with irregular migration. I suspect that where this row will ultimately resolve itself is that, as the government says in this story, look, we're not going to have a deal to return people from the UK to Ireland while there's not a deal to return people from the EU to the UK. But you've got to give to get in any negotiation, and I think it's going to be quite hard for a Conservative Prime Minister who, despite having been a Leaver for much longer than Boris Johnson, is not wholly trusted by many of the Leavers in his own parliamentary party. I think it's probably going to be hard for him in particular to do anything to resolve this particular row at a time when, as we've discussed earlier, he's got lots of problems with his party as it is.
Kate, how do you see it playing out?
Well, this is more complex because the Irish government is actually attempting to overturn a judgment in the Irish High Court last month, as the Time reports, saying that it would be unlawful to return asylum seekers to the UK because of the Rwanda scheme, because they don't deem that to be lawful. Now, expect the UK government to make quite a big deal out of this, the fact that the Irish government almost seemingly is in a slight way endorsing the Rwanda scheme, because they're saying, no, we do want to send them back. It can't be that bad. Rishi Sunak's point and the government's point will be every European country is having to deal with this. The irony of that is that Europe is going to have to work together to solve it. And to Stephen's point, we're very far away from that happening.
The Prime Minister making the point in his interview with Trevor Phillips on Sky News that the fact that people are moving into Ireland shows that the Rwanda scheme is acting as a deterrent already.
Well, it's possible. I think it's unlikely, given that people have already crossed the Channel, the world's busiest shipping lane, that they're going, oh dear, the tiny possibility that the government might one day be organised enough to put me on a flight to Rwanda is then causing them to cross into the Irish border. Ultimately, the reason why, there are two types of country in this world. Countries people want to leave and countries people want to come into. We're lucky in the UK that we're a country people want to come into, but that does have its own challenges, particularly if you are a country next to a big trade bloc which ideally wants to palm the problem off onto you. He is, however, right to say, as he said in the interview this morning, that the whole of the European centre-right is going this way. I think things like the Rwanda scheme, currently a bit of an oddity, are going to become increasingly normal as an option that European countries want to reach for. The difficulty is there is, as yet, no evidence that these schemes work.
Or that there are that many countries that want to volunteer themselves to be where people go.
We've just got about a minute to getting to the Guardian story regarding Thames Water's financial collapse and the ramifications of that.
Yes, this is the warning from the UK's Debt Management Office, which is saying that if Thames Water were to collapse, you could see more economic instability. And the comparison on the front page of The Guardian is the kind that we saw after Liz Truss's mini-budget, suggesting that there would be a spike in borrowing costs, that markets would expect a greater return. I would want to see more details in this story, because I think it would be very unclear that markets would think that Thames Water would be allowed to go bust, really. It would be quite obvious it would be taken into administration. I don't think even the government has been too unclear about that. It just does remind us how high those borrowing costs are right now, though, and how expensive things are for the government. It's probably another reason you wouldn't see a lot of state investment in water were it to be renationalised.
OK, we will leave it there. Kate and Stephen for the moment. Coming up, the Metro warns that beer drinkers are set to be out of pocket due to Britain's wet weather. We'll be discussing that next. Stay with us. Welcome back. You are watching the Press Preview. Still with me, Stephen Bush, Financial Times Associate Editor and columnist, and Kate Andrews, the Spectator Economics Editor. Let's have a look at the FT, front page of the Financial Times. And this story about foreign banks in Russia that have paid fourfold in terms of the tax that they paid to the Kremlin. And this is despite them promising to minimise their business in Russia following on from the Ukraine war.
Yeah, so So some of this is about assets, and these banks can't move from Russia for one reason or another. So as global interest rates have gone up, the interest on those reserves has gone up, they've paid more in profit. But some of it is about other activities, and some of it is because these Western banks, these 7 banks, are not sanctioned because they're not Russian banks, so they can still access the global payment system. Now, yeah, this is an important story for lots of reasons, not least, and it speaks to the anxiety across much of Europe that, there's been a failure to give Ukraine all of the arms it needs in order to repel the Russian invasion. There's an American election in which it looks very possible that Donald Trump, president who has suggested he could end the war overnight, and he almost certainly does not mean by helping Ukraine win, could come in. And then, in addition, their sanctions regime has proved ineffective. The Russian economy is still going. Banks, some would say, and indeed some would say correctly, that because they can't get out, but are still having to pay into the Russian war machine. So this is a story that is going to cause a lot of chatter and a lot of anxiety across Europe and across Whitehall.
But Kate, it's benefiting these foreign banks to remain in Russia because their profits have increased, haven't they?
Well, to some extent, to part of Stephen's point there, they can't access all of this to take it out or to enjoy the benefits of the profit. But as the FT reports, there has been a huge jump of 800 million euros in tax, up from 200 in 2021. And it does raise larger questions about the extent to which these sanctions are working against Russia. And I think that has been actually a mixed picture. While you have had some success, you also have complications like this, or actually keeping money in one place where you can't access it, it's essentially frozen, it's accruing interest, and there has to be tax paid on that. So I think it does continue to paint that mixed picture that what are sometimes good intentions do not pan out with the consequences that you'd like.
Let's have a look at the Times. Then this story regarding a benefits shake-up, perhaps the largest for very many years. Stephen, take us into this story.
Yeah, so millions of people on disability benefits face the biggest changes in a generation, which would mean which could mean those with sickness and with depression and anxiety lose their payments. Now, the thing which is politically difficult here is that for the Labour Party is they would find it very hard to oppose further oppose further reductions in the benefits bill, which would mean they would have to find some form of alternative tax rises to meet those costs from elsewhere, which is something they would also be very reluctant to do. But the very real human cost here is it's not, I would say, wholly clear what the policy case for what the government is doing. We have a problem with economic inactivity among people in their over 50s generally for physical conditions, and a problem of rising anxiety and depression among people who are still in some form of work in their 20s and 30s. So it's not obvious that the lever that they are pulling is going to fix the policy problem, but it is going to create a hell of a political headache for the Labour Party.
Is welfare reform going to be a key dividing line, do you think?
The government wants it to be because they don't think that the Labour Party is going to be willing to touch it, especially going into an election. There is a report from the Office for National Statistics which showed that at the start of last year, over 50% of the people who were registered inactive with long-term sickness had anxiety or depression as their top ailment. And of that group, 80% were deemed too unwell to work at all. I think those numbers have particularly caught the government's attention. They are increasingly worried that for some people, not all people, but some people suffering from anxiety and depression, getting them out of work, getting them away from other people, away from social interaction is going to make the problem worse, not better. And so I think there is a genuine human element to this where they're thinking, are we really making the right prescriptions? Are we really doing the right thing by removing people from work altogether? But of course, there's the political note as well, in which they think that this might play well with the electorate, and Labour will struggle to answer these questions.
The Prime Minister has said he's on a moral mission to reform welfare and warned that too many people are being parked on benefits. Just time to talk about the fact that the price of beer is going through the roof. Well, why, Stephen?
Bad weather. So it was a very rainy autumn, as people may remember, although many of us have kind of repressed that, which is going to hit the price of beer because it's going to hit the price of hops because it was a worse harvest than usual as a result of that bad weather. And so that means that the pint you're drinking will be more expensive.
And bread as well?
It's not mentioned
Biscuits?
here, but yeah,
Bread and biscuits.
Oh, is it? Yes, we got biscuits here as well. Yeah, depressing news given the fact that I think we've got used to inflation slowing, prices slowing, but certainly not dropping. They're still rising a bit, and if it rises on beer specifically, that's going to disappoint a lot of people going into the summer, myself included.
You a beer drinker?
I'm, to be honest, more concerned about the biscuits cost. It might be helpful for my waistline.
Me
if they got a little
too,
pricier.
me too. Stephen and Kate, thank you very much for the moment.